yourself, but the question of whether the airwaves are privately owned or government owned is one still to debate. The broadcast industry says no. Why is this such an issue? Like, who cares? Yeah, so it matters for the STOA LD topic too. It matters on electronic surveillance. It also matters because the airwaves are now worth bazillions of dollars. The government auctions off access to certain frequencies for 10, 20 billion dollars. It's huge. Well, the television networks are sitting on a huge fat amount of spectrum from when they needed it for analog broadcasts. So then they switched to digital, mandated by the federal government to digital. So now the television stations have sort of homesteaded way more wavelength than they need for television, even high def broadcast television. So what do? If your community is like mine, the local TV station has 4 channels now, or 3 channels. The main channel, and then they run, Abbott and Costello Meet Godzilla or some crazy show on these other stations. But the thing is, those are worth billions and billions and billions of dollars if they could sell it to cell phone companies and other private users for communications. They can't sell it because they don't own it. They've only got permission to use it from the federal government. And they won't give it up unless they pay for it. The federal government says, well, you didn't pay for it. Your big fat station is dominating this with your dumb shows. You're not using it. You should give it back to the government. And they say no. So now the issue is whether they're going to split it up. The government gets half the money and the company gets half the money. But the point is there's a huge battle over moving those wavelengths to higher valued uses. And that's why we're seeing these stupid TV shows and we get bad cell phone reception, is because we can't get to those wavelengths that are more valuable for cell phones and other stuff. So, history. So that's part of the discussion here. So these guys are lobbyists for the broadcast industry and say, this isn't government wavelength, this is ours. We should be able to sell it. We should be able to make more money on it. And the government saying, no, we're going to have net neutrality, we're going to give everybody access, and so on and so forth. Make sense? Why do you suppose you have all those stupid television stations with local community council members droning on endlessly on your TV? You suppose anybody watches that? Maybe, and their friends and family. It turns out that's there because of the cable monopoly. One cable company gets access to provide cable in your community, and in return they offer these community stations where you could go down and have your own high school debate show if you make a case for the public needs it. They give you access to it. They have these council things, but supposedly that's a benefit to the community, but in exchange they have this monopoly control. So I generally argue you want to get the government out of that. You don't want the government telling people what they can and can't do. Yeah.
So are there any circumstances that you wouldn't say a natural monopoly does exist, so you think the concept of it is just flawed in any application?
I do. But you can make the reasonable case that if you have 5 electricity companies in a town, they might be digging up the street, every which way to put 5 separate power lines down. So there are advantages to having a single company. One garbage collector means one garbage truck comes by your house. Or actually it's 3 now. One for the garbage, one for the recycling, one for the yard waste. But if you had 6 garbage companies, you'd have garbage trucks coming down your street, 3 times a day. So there are advantages to having a single company. But the government, you've got government antitrust policy, where if you do have a single company, they'll sue them for restraint of trade, right? If companies get together and raise the price, they get sued for gouging. If they cut the price too much, they get sued for dumping. If they keep the same price, they get sued for conspiracy against trade. So you've got all these regulations. There are advantages for a natural monopoly, but the thing is you don't want a government-enforced one. Yeah, well, and if it's a private company, you have sort of fascism in a sense. You have a government mandating one company be in charge. And again, I'm not saying it's terrible and everyone's going to be thrown out in the street poor. It's just that it raises the prices. That's why our cable is so dramatically expensive. And if you try and get just the stations you want instead of stations you don't want, no can do. You're going to pay a certain, if you don't like sports, you're still going to pay a boatload of money for ESPN. So this comes up in community standards. People can't choose the cable they want. So you've got this system where people battle over, what's going to be broadcast. So other areas of the topic? What else is left on electronic surveillance? Yeah.
Okay, this is kind of spoiler, but there was a lot of evidence because U.S. is significantly curtailing its space program because of budgetary reasons. But there's actually a lot of electronic surveillance you do in space, like SETI, which is trying to contact life out in space. There's asteroid surveillance or asteroid detection with satellites on Earth and electronic orbital satellites you launch out to help get a better view.
Uh-huh.
And of course, asteroid protection is good, keep good protectors. And satellites are electronic and also used for surveillance.
Yeah, we got all these.
Very important to our whole information infrastructure.
You've got all these spy satellites. Google just bought a new company. I think it's Google. It's a microsatellite company that can, look at your front door and stuff like that. It's much, much, much higher resolution, and they're going to use that supposedly for all sorts of business purposes. Yeah.
How can you weaponize this?
Well, surveillance by its nature doesn't include weapons. You're just monitoring. But obviously you could use it for weapon reasons. The drones are a big story, right? All these drones, inexpensive drones wandering around collecting information, video surveillance, balloons. But I haven't thought of the weaponized one. I mean, it's certainly strong military uses for surveillance information. I mean, you can wipe out the electromagnetic pulse, wipes out all this stuff. That's a weaponized use of electronics, but it's not surveillance. It's, stuff out. Yeah. So I don't know on that. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a. I don't see that as a surveillance case, but I think it's an important case to consider because we can all, a solar flare next week could wipe out a big part of the country. Yeah.
As we move into the debate here, do you have any tips for how to prove certain huge arguments that are going to be brought up, such as the right to privacy or just electronic surveillance laws in general? Do you have any tips for
Well,
huge resolution?
well, I don't know that it's so huge compared to the Middle East.
Yeah.
But I would separate all the privacy debates and the private sector monitoring. The government wants to regulate what the private sector does. They want to pass rules designed to protect people and to keep corporations from abusing their power. That sort of language is a whole part of sort of privacy advocates and people on one side who see corporations as the problem. On the other side are people who want to limit the size and scope of the federal government, and they fear government power. This regulation thing on this side has the potential of making all sorts of things criminal accidentally, right? All sorts of information. We might find that we're violating information. As one example, the Veterans Administration is under fire for all this, mismanagement, wasting billions of dollars or whatever. And you know how they're defending themselves? They are prosecuting people, whistleblowers in the Veterans Administration, for violating privacy rights of veterans. Because if they say Joe Blow died because of this, well, if you announce that information, you're violating his privacy rights under HIPAA. So this HIPAA stuff, which was designed to protect our medical privacy, is used by organizations to protect themselves. So same with a lot of all these other privacy laws, they're used to prosecute whistleblowers who are trying to bring information to the public. So anytime you increase the regulatory side, you're causing potential problems. Yeah.
What do you think about increasing border surveillance?
Yeah, electronic surveillance of the borders gives you information about who's crossing. Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Do you think it would be cost effective?
Well, if the federal government does it, it's not going to be cost effective. But you could say, in the interest of transparency, what we really care about is knowing who's coming across the border. I mean, the big thing with the border thing is to have a ability for people who come across to work, and that we want to know that they're not terrorists. That's the main thing. But if you're trying to stop everybody coming across the border, obviously you're going to have a problem. It's a big border. Okay?